Hello, my name is Alicia Kallal. I work for the University of Illinois Extension as a horticulture educator in Southern Illinois. This is the fourth and final section of the Seed Starting module of the Community Gardening webinar series. Previously, we covered an introduction to seed starting, planting seeds and providing the proper environment for germination, and the conditions of care required for seedling growth. In this presentation, I will explain the process of hardening off your seedlings in preparation for transplanting, and we'll finish off with instructions on how to set your transplants in the garden. As Martha discussed in the seedling growth section, the grow room temperature, media moisture, light intensity, and airflow are all controlled and consistently maintained to maximize healthy seedling growth. This controlled environment is very different from the environment outside, and without a transitional period, our plants will not survive this change. Some of the outdoor conditions that can cause problems for new transplants include intense sunlight, wind, reduced water, and colder temperatures. Hardening off is the process of gradually acclimating our plants to the outdoor environment before we transplant them into the garden. Before I dive into the details of the hardening off process, I want to talk a little bit about how we know when our seedlings are ready to transplant in the garden. In order to ensure that your seedlings have matured enough, you need to wait until they have developed at least 2 true adult leaves before you transplant. The very first leaves to emerge are called the cotyledons, or seed leaves. For many plants, the cotyledons will look different than the adult leaves. Tomatoes are a good example. In the bottom right picture, you can see the cotyledons on the tomato seedlings. They are lance-shaped with smooth edges, while the adult leaves have lobes. While you can transplant with 2 fully expanded adult leaves, it is common to wait until the plants are a little bit bigger than this. However, you do not want to wait too long and have your plants outgrow their container before transplanting. Healthy transplants should be short and stocky. A 2-to-1 ratio of plant height to pot height is a rough guide for the maximum growth that the container can sustain. Plants that are tall and spindly, and plants with pot-bound roots, as you can see in the picture on the bottom left, have undergone stress from remaining in a small container for too long. You should avoid this situation by transplanting as soon as possible after your plants have matured to an appropriate size. Now that we have considered the target size of your plants for transplanting, we should also consider timing for hardening off and transplanting within your overall garden schedule. Hardening off will take 7 to 10 days, so you will have to plan when to begin hardening off your plants in advance of your target transplant date. Before you started your seeds, you decided when to sow your seeds by counting back from your target outdoor planting date. That date was based upon the average frost-free date in your area, the hardiness or cold tolerance of the plant species, the length of time needed for the crop to mature, and how quickly the seedlings grow to the appropriate size for transplanting. As you begin to approach your target date to plant in your garden, you should evaluate if the weather conditions are suitable for planting and if your plants are mature. If all signs are a go, then you should begin the hardening off process at least 1 week before your planting date. Alright, now that we have established when it's time to harden off your seedlings, I will talk about the how. Our goal in hardening off our plants is to prepare them for the transition from their protected environment in our grow room to the outdoor environment. During hardening off, we gradually alter the growing conditions, making them more like the conditions outside. This will cause the plants to change the quality of their growth to withstand these new conditions. About 2 weeks before your transplant date, lower the temperature of your grow room and decrease the frequency of your watering. You can allow the soil surface to dry out between waterings, but do not let the plants wilt. 7 to 10 days before your transplant date, take the plants outside to a shady location that is protected from the wind. Leave the plants outside for 2 to 3 hours and then bring them back indoors. Over the next few days, gradually increase the length of time that the plants are kept outside, up to the point where you're outside for 12 hours per day. You can also increase the full sun exposure for your plants by about an hour per day. Keep the plants on your 12 hours per day regimen for a couple of days. Then after that, you can leave them outside 24 hours a day for a few more days. At this point, the plants should be ready to transplant. Rather than carrying the plants in and out of the house every day, another option is to use a cold frame. A cold frame is essentially a box with a clear glass or plastic lid that can be opened and closed. The plants are placed inside the cold frame with the lid open during the day so that they don't overheat, and with the lid closed at night to keep in some of that warmth and protect them from the cool overnight temperatures. If you have an unheated sunroom that receives good sun exposure, this might also be a good location to harden off your plants. The gradual change in the environment during hardening off allows the plants to make adjustments to their growth that will allow them to withstand outdoor conditions. You can think of hardening off as giving your plants a warning that they need to put on sunscreen before sending them out into the sun. Lowering the growing temperature and reducing water slows down the rate of plant growth, which allows the plants to become less succulent and tender. The slower growth allows the plant to put more energy into increasing the lignin content of its cell walls. Lignin is the compound responsible for making cell walls more tough and rigid. Another response to colder temperatures is the increase of carbohydrate concentrations in the plant cells. Soluble sugars have been shown to play a role in increasing cold tolerance. Gradually increasing sun exposure and decreasing water availability also promotes the thickening of the wax layer on the leaf surfaces. This wax layer helps to shield the leaf tissue from intense sunlight and helps to reduce water loss from transpiration. All of these adaptations allow the plants to withstand intense sunlight, wind, cold, and reduced water availability. Once you have your plants hardened off, they are ready to transplant. So now I will go over some tips for success and the steps for setting your transplants. Tip number 1 is to transplant either on a cloudy day or in the evening. These times are less stressful for the plants because the sunlight and heat are not as intense as they are at midday. Your transplants are less likely to wilt or experience transplant shock if they are planted during more favorable conditions. Tip number 2 for transplanting is to make sure you prepare your plants by watering them at least 1 hour before transplanting. Ideally, you should water in the morning before you transplant in the evening. Watering in advance ensures that your plants will have a good water status and will make the root ball easier to work with. In order to minimize stress to the roots during transplanting, the media needs to be moist. This will help the root ball hold together instead of crumbling and will keep the roots from drying out. Watering at least an hour before you transplant makes the job less messy because it allows time for excess moisture to drain out of the media. And it is better for the plant because it gives the plant a chance to take up some of the water before going through the stress of transplanting. Now that you know how to prepare your plants for transplanting, it is time to go through the step-by-step process. Step 1 is to dig the hole. Your hole should have the same depth as the plant's container, but should be twice as wide as the container. Making the hole wider provides an area of loose soil around the root zone where the roots can more readily expand. Planting too deep can cause stem rot and stunting of plant growth. One exception to the rule about planting depth is tomatoes. Tomatoes will actually grow new roots from any stem planted below the soil, so planting a few inches deeper than the container depth can increase the root mass of the tomato plant. Once you have your hole prepared, the second step is to take the plant out of its container. Squeezing the sides of the container near the top and the middle can help to loosen the root ball and free the plant from the container. Make sure to handle the plant gently to avoid damaging it. It also helps to tip the container sideways or downward rather than trying to pull the plant up and out. If you're using peat pots or other biodegradable pots, you do not have to remove the container entirely. However, any peat pot that sticks above the soil surface needs to be removed. If you leave peat pots sticking above the soil surface, it will act as a wick that pulls the moisture away from the roots. Once you have the plant free of the container, gently massage the root ball to rough up the sides and untangle any roots that have grown together in the shape of the container. Try to keep as much of the media attached to the root ball as you can. When the roots are prepped, you are ready for step 3. Place the plant in the center of the hole. Then you can fill the hole back in with soil and gently firm the soil around the root ball. The soil should be firm enough to anchor the plant and keep it standing upright. The fourth step is to thoroughly water the root zone. Watering will cause the soil to settle and will remove any large air pockets that were left when the hole was filled in. It's a good idea to use a soluble fertilizer solution at this time to give the plants a boost and get them off to a good start. A starter fertilizer will usually have a higher dose of phosphorus than a balanced fertilizer because phosphorus is an important nutrient for root growth. The fifth and final step of transplanting is to provide any necessary protection or support for your plants. Protecting your garden from wildlife may require several different strategies and will vary depending upon the types of animals that you have in your area. Fencing is a measure that can work well for pest exclusion as long as the fence is designed with the wildlife in mind. Think about how high the animals can jump or climb, if the animals can burrow, and how small the holes in the fence mesh will need to be to create a sufficient barrier. Some other mechanisms to protect your garden from wildlife include bird netting and animal repellents. If your garden location has strong prevailing winds, you will need to shelter your new transplants from the wind with some sort of temporary covering. This could be a tomato cage with a plastic or fabric wrap around the sides, a milk jug with the bottom cut off placed over the plant, or any number of creative structures that you can fabricate with the materials you have on hand. You should avoid sealing the plant entirely inside of a container, however, because it could easily overheat like the inside of your car on a summer day. As the plant grows and becomes established, this temporary covering can be removed. The time of transplant is also the best time to install support structures such as stakes or cages that will be used to train and manage the plants as they grow larger. It is much easier to put a tomato cage over a small plant and let it grow up through the cage than it is to try and put a tomato cage on a plant that has already grown large and sprawling. This concludes the fourth and final presentation in our seed starting module. In this series, you have learned how to decide if starting plants from seeds is right for you, how to plan your seed starting timeline, how to create a good environment for germination and seedling growth, and how to harden off your plants and transplant them into the garden. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and will continue watching the rest of the Community Gardening webinar series. I'd also like to encourage you to visit the University of Illinois Extension State Horticulture website for more information about a wide range of horticulture topics. We have resources covering fruit and vegetable production, lawn care, herb gardening, pollinator gardening, and much, much more. If you have any questions about this presentation, feel free to contact me or Martha at the contact email addresses listed here.